Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to do my best to try to cover what has become the very hot topic as of late, thanks to one of my fellow YouTube reviewers, and that is the focus breathing issue. Now, I will say before I go any further in this review, in that about 4 years ago, I reviewed the previous generation. This is Tamron's A009, their internal code, and it was the 70-200 f2.8 VC lens. I covered that, and it had the exact same characteristics when it comes to the focus breathing issue as the new 70-200 G2 lens. And I've had thousands of people read that review, and I don't recall having had one person comment on the focus breathing issue. And so I just want you to know that right now this is a big deal because it has been made a big deal. However, the whole picture I think is a little bit more complicated than perhaps what has been represented so far. But to be fair, this is an issue and it will affect people in some situations. And so I want to do my best to cover it. And so to that end, Tamron has been kind enough to provide me. I actually now have 2 copies of the 70-200 G2 lens, and so that I can check for sample variation and make sure that I am kind of reporting accurately on its abilities. I have the previous generation Tamron 70-200. I also have the Canon 70-200 f2.8L Mark II here, and then just because of the focus breathing comparison, on a little bit I'm going to add in the 100-400 millimeter f4.5 to 5.6 LIS Mark II lens. I also have tested these lenses using both Tamron's new teleconverters, that's the 1.4 and the 2 times, and then also, because I already owned it, the Canon, this is the 1.4 time, and this is the Mark III that I have. And so we're going to just take a look at this overall issue. We're going to look at the focus breathing, the maximum magnification, and see how things shake out with this. All right, we'll start with the obvious here. This is a distance of about 8 feet here, and so both lenses, Tamron is going to be on the left during these series of comparisons, and this is the A025 or the G2 lens, and then the Canon 70-200L Mark II is going to be on the right side. So it's pretty clear that there is some focus breathing that's taking place here at 8 feet, and so you can see a pretty marked difference in the overall framing between the 2 lenses. Now, it's also interesting to note, however, if we compare the A025, the G2, with the previous generation A09, which is just the 70-200 VC lens, that they frame basically identically. The focus breathing is about equal on both lenses, and I would say that both lenses frame about equally, and if we look from the distance from the side to the lens itself, I would say we're getting pretty much the same distance overall, although obviously we are getting a sharper result here with the newer lens by comparison. But in terms of the actual focus breathing, I would say that they both kind of breathe to the same extent and are about equal distance from the edge of the frame here. Now, if we line the lenses perfectly here in the center, we see that they are basically filling the frame to equal extent here. And if we are to zoom in a bit, I don't really see a difference. Now, this is kind of a ridiculous level. This is a 2-to-1, so a 200% magnification, but still overall I'm not really seeing any difference in the size of each one of the letters there, and so the focus breathing is equal on both of these lenses. Similarly, if we compare the lenses at 135 millimeters, we see that they are basically occupying the same section of the frame here, and if we zoom into a pixel level, we see that they are framing basically identically at 135 millimeters. However, you can definitely see that there is a sharper result from the newer lens. Now, if we compare the 2 lenses with them at basically the pretty close to the minimum focus distance for the Canon lens, which is it's greater than that of the Tamron G2 lens, we see that that focus breathing is definitely exhibited there, in that the image from the Canon is noticeably larger than that of the G2 lens. However, the G2 lens is able to focus down to a closer distance, and so here they both are at their minimum focus distance, and still, of course, you can see the focus breathing exhibited there. The new G2 lens, it exhibits a maximum magnification of 0.163 times compared to the Canon's 0.21 times, and so you can see that difference there. The advantage here for the second generation, the G2 lens, when you compare it with the last generation A09 lens, is that while they both have the same amount of focus breathing, the difference is that the new lens can focus in considerably closer, which gives it a much more useful maximum magnification figure, as you can see here, compared to the 0.125 times magnification of the VC lens, which was a pretty poor performance and one of my least favorite things about the lens. And so at least this here has become a useful type of magnification as compared to the other lens. Now, I ran a series of tests to see how the focus breathing, how it changed as you moved away from the subject. And so obviously we've seen at minimum focus distance, at least the Canon's minimum focus distance, that the difference is quite startling. Now, if we compare these, we're going to look at three different focus distances, and those are, we're going to look first at a distance of 6 feet, and then a distance of 12 feet, and then a distance of 18 feet. And so at a distance of 6 feet, we can see here comparing the two. What I did is I zoomed in to 200 millimeters, and then from the same position, I basically zoomed out the Canon until I got similar framing along the edges. And so while we can see that you know, these are basically equal, and so we're at 145 millimeters on the Canon, and so that shows that at that close focus distance of about 6 feet, that the focus breathing is quite severe. Now as we move back to a distance of 12 feet and compare the two, we see that the focus breathing is starting to ease a bit, and to get basically equivalent framing, I had to zoom to 168 millimeters on the Canon and to get about the equivalent framing. And then if we move on out to 18 feet, to get the similar framing, I was at 182 millimeters on the Canon. And so I extrapolate that by that, and I was out of space to go back any further, but I extrapolate that moving out between about another 6 feet should have them framing roughly equally, and the Tamron starting to achieve its true focal length. Now, it's worth noting that the Tamron, that this isn't really a third-party problem, and if anything, almost all of the newer Canon lenses, zoom lenses that I have reviewed, have actually exhibited focus breathing. Here is a case in point. Here we've got the Tamron, and although it's reporting as being 280 millimeters and having a 1.4 times, that's actually a quirk here, and this is actually with the 2 times Tamron teleconverter here, and so actually we are at 400 millimeters on the Tamron. So we can see using the teleconverter that the Tamron and then the Canon, they frame, if not completely equally, they frame pretty close. And if we look at this edge, there is just a few millimeters of extra showing here on the left side of the Tamron image, and similarly over here on the right side, they are framing very, very close. And so I would say that this combination, there is just a hair more focus breathing, just a few millimeters worth when you compare the Tamron with at 400 millimeters with the teleconverter with the 400 millimeter of the Canon 100 to 400L Mark II. Now we can see how much focus breathing is taking place on the 100 to 400L Mark II if we throw that same 2 times teleconverter onto the Canon 70 to 200L Mark II. And so we can see at a distance of 10 feet, which I did this comparison at, that there is a pretty dramatic difference in the amount of magnification and thus focal length of the 400 millimeters of the Canon combination, which has that same kind of communication quirk here. You can see that there's a considerable difference, and so much more difference here than there was between the Tamron and the Canon. And so overall, there definitely is a pretty considerable amount of focus breathing that is taking place with the Canon 100 to 400L. And so certainly there is some focus breathing, and that is reflected in the overall maximum magnification, where the Canon has a reproduction ratio of 0.21 times, while the Tamron has a 0.163 times. Now, just to elaborate on that, the previous generation Tamron, which as I noted, people weren't complaining about the focus breathing on it, although it focus breathes to the same extent. On top of that, it also couldn't focus down as closely, and so as a result, it had a much poorer 0.125 times magnification, meaning that if anything, this new Tamron 70-200 G2 has improved in this overall, while not in the focus breathing, in the ability to focus down closer and thus becoming more useful for shooting close-ups of things at weddings. That's about a 25% improvement in the magnification ratio. Now, the actual tops in this category was Tamron's original 70-200, which focused down as close as the G2 lens, but it did not focus breathe, and thus it had an amazing 0.32 times magnification, which blows the Canon's figure out of the water. And so, and it accomplished that by being able to focus down very close, but also not having any focus breathing. But here's what happened. Between that lens and the Generation 1, the VC lens, they added a tremendous amount of complexity into the new Tamron lens. 5 more elements into the optical formula. They added on a true ring type USM motor. And on top of that, they added in the VC, or the vibration compensation image stabilization system. All of these new components, plus, vastly improved optics into an actual smaller body than what the previous generation was. So the thing that gave, yeah, you guessed it, it was focus breathing. And so the lens couldn't focus down as closely, and of course it gave up some focal length at close distances. But here's the thing, I do want to make this point, and that is that this has kind of been presented as being a third-party issue. That's not even really close to being true. In fact, all of the recent Canon telephoto zoom lenses that I have reviewed have all focus breathed, and that includes EFM mount 55-200 STM. That includes the EFS 55-250 STM lens. That includes the new Canon 70-300 IS Mark II, which focus breathed vastly compared to the Tamron 70-300 VC lens. The Canon 70-300L focus breathe, and this lens, of course, it focus breathes quite a bit. This is the 100-400L Mark II. In fact, when I put the 2x converter on the Tamron, it frames almost identically, just a hair wider to what this lens does at about 10 feet distance. And of course, the Canon with the 2x converter, the 70-200 with the 2x at 400 millimeters, it frames much, much tighter than what the 100-400L2 does. So the one thing that's a part of this equation is, of course, that of all these lenses, the oldest one in the group is actually the Canon 70-200L Mark II. There has been a shift in the overall lens-making ideology in recent years, and that includes, unfortunately, focus breathing. And that was such a big issue with the Nikon 70-200 VR2 that was one of the main things that they had to address because there was so much backlash over that. And so in their new ED lens, 70-200 millimeters, it helps to correct that problem. So I'm not going to try to pretend that the new Tamron doesn't focus breathe, but here's what I do want to say. It's not a third-party issue. In fact, it's pretty systemic across the board in the newer telephoto lenses that I've reviewed. On top of that, it's no worse than the previous generation Tamron lens. In fact, it actually performs better in that it can focus down closer and thus becomes a more useful lens for people that are going to shoot weddings or headshots, any of those things. And so overall, Tamron hasn't taken a step back here. It, if anything, has taken a little bit of a step forward. Now, if this is still a real issue for you, and as I said, for years, this lens has been in existence. I reviewed it years ago. No one was complaining about focus breathing. It did focus breathe. This lens focus breathes. I hear very little about focus breathing on the 100-400L Mark II. But what has happened is this has become a hot button topic right now, at least on the YouTube and internet community. Very likely that backlash will die down as people forget about that. But if you think that this is seriously an issue for you, then you would be better off going with the much more expensive Canon 70-200L Mark II, or if you're a Nikon shooter, the even more expensive 70-200 ED VR lens that just recently came out. Unfortunately, if you go with the VR Mark II, it actually focus breathes more than what either of the Tamrons does. So hopefully that helps to clarify things a little bit for you, and I've done my best to be as nuanced and balanced on this topic. That, you know, there is some upside to this design for focus breathing. A lot of lenses are able to focus down more closely than the lenses that they replace, and that has been a big deal, that some photographers felt like they weren't able to get close enough in certain situations. That is often improved in new lenses, but focus breathing is part of how they achieve that. The other trade-off is that often they perform better at minimum focus distance, they produce better results, but in that kind of medium phase, or close to medium, from say about 6 to 18 to 20 feet, you do lose a little bit of focal length and thus a little bit of compression as a part of the focus breathing condition. I'm Dustin Abbott, and you can take a look in the link down below or the description and find a linkage to my ongoing image gallery. I'm adding a lot of new photos to it right now. I've taken a lot of shots with this new lens and putting them there. And then, of course, I will be covering the overall image quality in my next segment, and then bringing you a final verdict, an overall look at the lens and its real-world use after that. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.